The grand ballroom on the top floor of the Sterling Tower felt less like a room and more like a different world. From the ceiling, three massive chandeliers hung like captured galaxies, their light sparkling off the countless glasses of champagne and the diamonds, draped around the necks of the city's most powerful people. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and the low, excited hum of 100 conversations all happening at once. This was the party of the year, the 20th anniversary gala for Sterling Innovations, and every important person was there at the center of it all. Moving through the crowd like a ship through a calm sea was the man of the hour, Richard Sterling. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that seemed to be made just for him, which it was. His smile was easy and practiced, a tool he had mastered over 2 decades of building an empire. He shook hands with a politician, clapped a board member on the back, and complimented a rival CEO on her new dress. To everyone watching, he was the picture of success. He had it all: the company, the money, the respect. He was a king in a castle made of glass and steel, looking down on the city he had helped shape. But if you looked very closely, past the perfect smile and the confident eyes, you might have seen something else. A flicker of distance, a hint of a man who was watching his own life like a movie. As he smiled and nodded, his mind was somewhere else entirely. He thought about the long hours he had spent in front of a computer screen, the deals he had made, the competitors he had outsmarted. He had built a world that connected millions of people, yet he had never felt more alone. The faces in the crowd were a blur of familiar strangers. They saw the CEO, the icon, the billionaire. They didn't see the man who sometimes woke up in the middle of the night in his huge, empty penthouse with a strange feeling that he had forgotten something incredibly important. A young man, no older than 25, approached him with wide, admiring eyes. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice full of nerves, "I just want to say you're my hero. What you've built here. It's the future. I hope one day I can be half the leader you are." Richard gave him the same warm smile he gave everyone. "Keep working hard, son. The future belongs to those who build it." But as the young man walked away, beaming, Richard felt a pang of something sharp and uncomfortable. He saw the same fire in that kid's eyes that he once had. A fire not for money or power, but for the pure joy of creating something new. When did that fire for him turn into a cold, calculated ambition? He couldn't remember. It felt like it had happened slowly, without him even noticing. He remembered a time when his biggest dream wasn't a stock price, but a simple melody. The thought hit him so hard that he had to stop for a moment, taking a sip of his champagne to steady himself. The bubbles felt sharp on his tongue. Just then, a soft chime rang through the room, and a voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats. Our host for the evening, Mr. Richard Sterling, would like to say a few words." This was the moment. The reason for the knot that had been tightening in his stomach all night. He had given hundreds of speeches. He could talk about profit margins and market shares in his sleep. But this speech was different. He had thrown out the speech his public relations team had written for him. This one he had written himself, alone in his office late the night before. His hands shaking slightly as he typed the words, he walked towards the stage, the crowd parting for him. The applause was loud and warm. He climbed the steps, the spotlight hitting him in the face, blinding him to the individual faces in the crowd. They were just a sea of shadows now. He gripped the sides of the wooden podium, the cool wood a small comfort under his sweaty palms. He took a breath and began. "Thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight," he started, his voice strong and clear, just like always. 20 years. It feels like a lifetime, and it also feels like it was just yesterday that we were working out of a tiny garage with a big dream. He went on like this for a few minutes, talking about the company's journey. He mentioned the first big breakthrough, the challenges they had faced, and the amazing team that had made it all possible. It was a good speech. It was the speech everyone expected. The crowd nodded and smiled, proud to be part of such a success story. Then he paused. He looked down at his notes, then back up at the dark room. "But you know," he said, his voice suddenly quieter, more personal, "all of this, The company, the building, the success? It's not what I'm most proud of. And it's not the most important thing I've learned in the last 20 years. A confused silence fell over the room. This was not part of the plan. People shifted in their seats, whispering to each other. What was he doing? Richard continued, his voice gaining a new kind of strength. Not the power of a CEO, but the courage of a man being honest for the first time in a long time. I've spent my life building things out of metal and code, things you can touch and see. But I've learned that the most important things in life can't be built. They can't be bought. They have to be nurtured. They have to be remembered. He took another deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He was about to do something that would shock everyone, something that might make people think he had lost his mind. But he didn't care anymore. The recent health scare he had kept a secret from everyone had shown him that his legacy wasn't a company. It was the people he loved and the bridges he had let burn. So tonight, he said, his voice now almost a whisper, I'm not going to talk about business. I want to talk about someone who taught me what passion really is. Someone who taught me that a single song can be worth more than all the money in the world. I have a secret guest with me tonight. Someone who isn't on any guest list. Someone I should have invited a long, long time ago. He looked towards the large, heavy doors at the back of the ballroom. Every head in the room turned with him. The air was electric with curiosity. Who could it be? A famous rock star? A legendary artist no one had seen in years? The tension was unbearable. Then, with a soft creak, the big doors began to swing open. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a soft, almost silent creak, but the sound seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the room. Every eye was fixed on that dark doorway, expecting a famous movie star, a legendary politician, or perhaps a world-renowned artist. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind you feel just before a magician reveals their greatest trick. But the figure who stepped through the doorway was none of those things. He was just a man, an older man, probably in his late 50s, with hair that was more salt than pepper and a face that showed the lines of a life lived outdoors, not in boardrooms. He was wearing a simple, dark jacket, the kind of thing you'd wear on a cool autumn evening, not at a gala where a single plate of food cost more than most people's weekly pay. The jacket was worn at the elbows, and in his hand he carried a black, scuffed acoustic guitar case that looked like it had been on 1,000 journeys. He stood there for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the light, looking like a sailor who had just washed ashore on a planet made of glass and gold. A confused buzz went through the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was everywhere like a swarm of invisible bees. People leaned in to whisper to their neighbors, their perfectly manicured hands covering their mouths. A woman in a shimmering blue gown raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a look of pure disbelief on her face. A man with a thick gold watch shook his head slightly, as if he thought this was some kind of strange, unfunny joke. Who was this person? This wasn't a secret guest. This looked like someone who had gotten lost on his way to a much different party. From the stage, Richard watched his brother enter. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, wild beat that had nothing to do with the soft jazz playing in the background. This was it. The moment of no return. He had spent weeks building up the courage for this. Ever since the doctor's words had sent a cold shock through his entire system. You need to slow down, Richard, the doctor had said. All the money in the world can't buy you more time. Those words had echoed in his mind, making him re-evaluate everything. And the first thing he had realized was how much time he had wasted, how much he had lost. Seeing Leo now, standing there looking so out of place, a wave of regret so powerful it almost brought him. To his knees washed over him, he remembered a time when that worn guitar case was the most important thing in their shared world. He could almost smell the old wood and the rosin from the bow of the violin Leo used to play. They were kids then, sharing a small bedroom, dreaming not of stock prices and corporate takeovers, but of melodies and harmonies. Leo was the talented one, the one who could hear a song once and play it perfectly. Richard was the one who was good with numbers, who figured out how to book the gigs and handle the tiny bit of money they made. They were a team. But then Richard had gotten a scholarship to a prestigious business school, and the world of logic and profit had pulled him away. Leo had seen it as a betrayal. He had called him a sellout, a man who was trading his soul for a corner office. The fight had been ugly, and they hadn't spoken since. That was 10 years ago. 10 years of silence, filled only with the occasional, painful news he'd hear from a distant relative. Taking a deep breath, Richard moved. He walked down the steps from the main stage, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He didn't say a word to the crowd. He just walked, his eyes locked on his brother. As he moved, the crowd seemed to part for him, like the sea parting for a prophet. The whispers died down, replaced by a stunned collective silence. People watched, their mouths slightly agape, as the most powerful man in the room walked purposefully towards the most out-of-place person they had ever seen. When Richard reached him, he didn't hesitate. He reached out and put a hand on his brother's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. Leo flinched slightly, surprised by the touch, but then he relaxed, a flicker of something unreadable in his tired eyes. For a moment, they just stood there, two brothers from two different worlds, connected by a single point of contact. The contrast was striking. Richard, in his flawless tuxedo, the picture of modern success. Leo, in his worn jacket, the picture of a life lived on its own terms. "Leo," Richard said, his voice quiet, meant only for his brother. "Thank you for coming." Leo just nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. Richard began to guide him through the crowd. It was the longest walk of his life. Every step was a negotiation with his past. He could feel the hundreds of eyes on him, burning into his back. He knew what they were thinking. They were confused, maybe even concerned for him. Was their brilliant CEO having some kind of breakdown? He was risking his reputation, the very image of control and perfection he had spent 20 years building. But as he looked at the profile of his brother, the man who had taught him what it meant to feel something deeply, he knew it was a risk worth taking. The company would survive. His reputation could be repaired. But the chance to mend this broken bond might never come again. He didn't lead Leo to the main stage he had just left. That stage was for speeches and awards, for things made of glass and metal. Instead, he led him to a small, intimate platform set up in a quiet corner of the ballroom, where a jazz trio was supposed to play later in the evening. There was just a single wooden stool and a microphone stand sitting there, looking humble and unassuming. It felt right. This wasn't a performance for a king. It was a sharing between brothers. Richard gently took the guitar case from Leo and placed it on the floor next to the stool. Then he turned to face the room, picking up the small microphone from its stand. The spotlight followed him, illuminating the two of them in a soft, warm glow. "I know you're all wondering what's going on," Richard began, his voice no longer the powerful, commanding tone of a CEO, but something softer, more vulnerable. "This is my brother, Leo." A ripple of recognition went through some of the older guests who had known the family. "A long time ago," Richard continued, his eyes finding Leo's, "my brother and I had a dream. It didn't involve balance sheets or global markets. It involved this." He gestured to the guitar case. "Leo is the reason I understood what passion means. He taught me that you can't create something truly great unless you put a piece of your soul into it. And I forgot that lesson. I got so busy building a company that I forgot to nurture the most important things in my life." He paused, swallowing hard. "So tonight, I'm not the CEO. I'm just a brother who is very happy to have his brother here. And he's agreed to play a song for us." With that, Richard placed the microphone back in its stand and stepped back into the shadows, leaving Leo alone under the soft light, sitting on the simple wooden stool. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. The guests watched, a mix of pity, curiosity, and confusion on their faces. They were expecting a disaster, an awkward display from the CEO's black sheep brother. Leo didn't look at the crowd. He just reached down, slowly unlatched the worn guitar case, and lifted out a beautiful, aged acoustic guitar. He ran his hand lovingly over the wood, then took a deep breath and positioned his fingers on the frets. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting. The silence that fell over the ballroom was not a comfortable one. It was a heavy, awkward blanket, smothering the last of the excited whispers. The waitstaff, who had been moving like graceful shadows with trays of champagne, were now frozen in place, their eyes wide with curiosity. In the front row, a woman in a dazzling green gown slowly lowered her glass, her perfectly painted lips slightly parted in disbelief. Every single person was focused on the small, humble stage in the corner where the older man, Leo, now sat. The spotlight, which had seemed so flattering on the CEO, now felt harsh and exposing, illuminating every wrinkle on Leo's face and every scuff mark on his old guitar. From the shadows just beyond the small stage, Richard watched. He had stepped back, deliberately making himself a part of the audience. He could feel the soft velvet of the curtain against his hand, a small, grounding sensation in a moment that felt completely unreal. His heart was still beating a little too fast, a frantic drum against his ribs. A part of him, the CEO part that had ruled his life for 20 years, was screaming at him. This was a mistake. It was unprofessional. It was a PR disaster waiting to happen. These people were sharks, and he had just chummed the water with his own vulnerability. But another, quieter part of him, a part he hadn't listened to in a very long time, felt a sense of profound rightness. He was no longer on a stage, giving a speech. He was just a brother, waiting to hear a song. He watched Leo's hands, the way they moved over the strings of the guitar with a familiar, gentle confidence, and he remembered the doctor's words again. He wasn't just building a bridge back to his brother. He was trying to find his way back to himself. On the stool, Leo felt the weight of 100 stares. They weren't just looking at him. They were judging him. He could feel it in the air, a silent, collective assessment. He saw the expensive clothes, the cold jewelry, the bored, beautiful faces. To them, he was a curiosity, a freak show, the CEO's embarrassing secret. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, washed over him. How dare Richard pull him into this? How dare he parade him in front of these people like some kind of redeemed project? He had spent years building a life away from this world, a life where his worth wasn't measured in stock options or market share. He had chosen to be poor but free, and now his brother had trapped him in a gilded cage. His fingers, which knew the fretboard of his guitar better than he knew his own face, felt clumsy. He almost stood up and walked away. He wanted to put the guitar back in its case and disappear through those heavy doors, leaving this artificial world behind him forever. But then, his eyes scanned the crowd and found Richard's. He wasn't looking at him like a CEO looking at an employee. He wasn't even looking at him like a brother putting on a show. He was looking at him with an expression that was so raw, so full of regret and hope, that it took Leo's breath away. It was the same look he had on his face when he was 7 years old and had broken their mother's favorite vase. The look that said, "I'm sorry and I don't know how to fix it." In that moment, the anger in Leo's chest began to cool, replaced by a tired, aching sadness. He saw not the billionaire CEO, but the little brother he used to share a room with. The brother who used to fall asleep listening to him practice. He took a deep, slow breath, the air tasting of flowers and wine. He looked down at the guitar in his hands. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was his oldest friend. It had been with him through smoky bars, street corners, and quiet, lonely nights. It had never judged him. It had only ever asked him to be honest. So he decided to be honest. He ignored the crowd. He ignored the cameras. He ignored the entire world of sterling innovations. He closed his eyes for a second, blocking it all out, and just listened to the hum of the strings under his fingers. His left hand found its place on the neck of the guitar, his calloused fingertips pressing down on the frets with a practiced ease. In his right hand he held a simple, worn pick. The room was so quiet that the small scraping sound as he positioned the pick against the strings seemed to echo. A man in the front row, who had been smirking, slowly straightened his tie, his smirk fading. The cynical energy in the room was beginning to curdle into something else, something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. Then Leo's fingers moved. He didn't strum a loud, attention-grabbing chord. Instead, he picked out a single, clear note. It hung in the air, pure and lonely, like a star in an empty sky. Then another note followed, and another, slowly weaving together a melody that was both beautiful and deeply sad. It was the kind of music that didn't just fill a space. It created a new one. It was a sound that seemed to pull the memories and longings out of the very walls of the ballroom. The song was not fast or flashy. It was slow and deliberate, each note like a word in a long, heartfelt letter. The melody told a story of open roads and quiet rooms, of laughter that had faded and promises that had been broken. It was the sound of regret, but also of a love that was too strong to ever completely die. Richard felt the music like a physical touch. It didn't just enter his ears. It seeped into his bones. He was no longer standing in a ballroom full of billionaires. He was a teenager again, sitting on the floor of his childhood bedroom, watching his brother compose this very song on a beat-up old guitar they had bought with money from mowing lawns. He remembered the feeling of awe he had, watching Leo create something so beautiful out of thin air. He remembered the promise he had made to himself back then, that he would never lose that feeling, that he would always protect his brother's talent. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, a small payment on a long overdue debt. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The judgment had evaporated. The cynicism was gone. People were leaning forward in their seats, their faces softening. The woman in the green gown had a hand pressed to her heart. The man with the gold watch had completely forgotten about it. They were no longer seeing the CEO's black sheep brother. They were seeing an artist. They were hearing a truth that transcended their world of deals and acquisitions. The music was a universal language, and everyone in the room was fluent in its dialect of loss and love. Leo had not sung a single word, but he had already said more than Richard had in his entire speech. The song built to a gentle, aching crescendo, and then, as the last note faded into a profound and sacred silence, Leo opened his eyes, looked out at the stunned crowd, and leaned towards the microphone. Leo leaned towards the microphone, the metal cool against his lips. For a moment he just breathed, his eyes scanning the crowd but not really seeing them. He was looking through them into a past only he and his brother could see. Then he opened his mouth, and a voice, rough as gravel but clear as a mountain stream, filled the silent room. "You chased the sun across the sky," he began, the words hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. "You built your wings to learn to fly. And I just watched you get so high, you forgot the ground beneath your feet." The melody was simple, almost like a folk song, but the words cut through the fancy room like a sharp knife. There was no anger in his voice, only a deep, weary sadness. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet finality of a closed book. The effect on the room was immediate and electric. A man who had been whispering to his date about a stock market tip suddenly went silent, his mouth hanging open. The clinking of ice and glasses, which had been the background music of the party, stopped completely. It was as if Leo had reached out and turned a dial, muting the entire world except for his guitar and his voice. People who had been leaning back in their chairs, looking bored or superior, were now leaning forward, their faces softened with a dawning understanding. They weren't just listening to a song. They were being let in on a secret, a family history laid bare in the most public of places. Richard felt the first line of the song like a punch to the gut. He was no longer the powerful CEO in a tuxedo. He was a young man again, standing in a dusty garage, holding a business plan that glittered with promise, while his brother held a guitar that hummed with soul. He remembered Leo telling him, "Don't fly so high you can't see me down here." He had laughed it off, thinking his brother was just being dramatic. Now, hearing those words sung back to him, wrapped in a melody that felt like a homesickness he didn't know he had, he realized it wasn't a warning. It was a plea, and he had ignored it. Leo's fingers moved on the fretboard, coaxing another verse from the old guitar. I stayed here on the dusty ground, I played my songs to empty towns. I sent my letters with no sound, hoping you'd come back to me. His eyes were closed now, his whole body swaying slightly with the rhythm. He was lost in the music, in the memory. He wasn't performing for the billionaires in the audience. He was singing to the ghost of the brother he once knew, the one who used to sit on the end of his bed and listen to him practice until their mother yelled at them to go to sleep. A young woman, one of the company's top software engineers, felt a tear roll down her cheek. She had always idolized Richard. He was her mentor, her hero. She saw him as a machine, a perfect, unstoppable force of nature. But this song was peeling back the metal and wires and showing her the beating, broken heart underneath. She looked over at Richard and saw his face, stripped of all its CEO armor. She saw the glistening track of a tear on his cheek, and in that moment, her admiration for him deepened into something else, something more like respect. It was easy to be strong when you had everything. It took real courage to be vulnerable when you had the most to lose. The song moved into its chorus, a simple, repeating melody that felt like a heartbeat. And one song's all I have to say, to bridge the silence of the days. A single note to find a way back to the brother I once knew. As Leo sang the words, his voice cracked slightly on the last line, a tiny fissure in his emotional control that made the song even more powerful. It was the sound of a dam breaking. The woman in the green gown, who had been so composed earlier, was now openly crying, using a silk napkin to dab at her eyes. The man with the thick gold watch had taken it off and was holding it in his hand, his knuckles white. The song was doing something to them all. It was bypassing their brains, their logic, their carefully constructed public personas, and speaking directly to their hearts, to their own regrets and their own lost connections. For Richard, the chorus was a tidal wave. It washed over him, pulling him under into a sea of memories. He saw Leo, his face alight with excitement, showing him his first guitar. He saw them performing together at a high school talent show, Leo's fingers flying on the strings while Richard nervously kept the beat on a bongo drum. He saw the fight, the ugly, screaming match in their tiny apartment after Richard announced he was dropping out of the music scene to go to business school. "You're selling out," Leo had yelled, his face red with anger and hurt. "I'm building a future," Richard had yelled back. Now, sitting in the silence of the ballroom, he saw the truth. He hadn't been building a future. He had been escaping a past. He had been so afraid of failing, of ending up playing in empty towns, that he had run away from the one person who believed in him. No matter what. Leo played the final verse, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "The years have passed, the world has changed, the promises we made seem strange. But in this song, the truth remains. I love you, brother, can't you see?" The last note of the guitar hung in the air, a shimmering, fragile thing. It didn't fade away all at once. It seemed to float above the crowd, growing softer and softer until it was absorbed by the profound silence that had fallen over the room. No one moved. No one spoke. No one clapped. It was the most complete and total silence Richard had ever experienced. It wasn't an awkward silence or a bored one. It was a sacred silence. It was the sound of 100 people holding their breath, processing the raw, unfiltered truth they had just witnessed. They had come to a party celebrating money and success, and they had been given a lesson in love and loss. In that moment, they weren't CEOs or investors or socialites. They were just people reminded of their own brothers, their own sisters, their own forgotten promises. The song had stunned them not with its complexity, but with its honesty. And in the heavy, holy quiet, the man who had everything finally realized what he had been missing. The silence stretched, thin and fragile like ice on a winter puddle. No one wanted to be the first to break it, to shatter the sacred space that Leo's song had created. The air in the grand ballroom felt different, cleaner, as if the melody had washed away the artificial scent of money and ambition and replaced it with something real and raw. People sat frozen, their glasses forgotten in their hands, their eyes fixed on the small stage. They looked like statues in a museum, captured forever in a moment of profound, shared emotion. The man with the gold watch was staring at his empty hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The woman in the green gown had both her hands pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. From his place in the shadows, Richard felt the silence like a physical weight. It was the silence of 1,000 unspoken words, of a decade of regret, all condensed into a single, breathtaking moment. He saw his brother sitting there, his head bowed over the guitar, looking small and tired under the spotlight. A wave of something powerful broke over him. It wasn't pity, but a deep, overwhelming love. It was the kind of love he had forgotten existed, a love that had nothing to do with success or failure, with right or wrong. It just was. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't let this moment end. He couldn't let his brother walk out that door again. Then a single sound broke the spell. It wasn't loud. It was a slow, deliberate clap, coming from a young woman near the front. It was the software engineer who had been crying. Her clap wasn't one of polite applause you give after a speech. It was a clap of understanding, a single, clear note of respect in the quiet. For a second, she was the only one clapping. Her hand moved in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Then the man sitting next to her, a stern-looking investor, joined in. His clap was a little hesitant at first, then it grew firmer. Like a single spark in a dry forest, the sound began to spread. Another person joined in, then another, then a whole table. It wasn't a sudden explosion of noise. It grew organically, a wave of sound building slowly, steadily until it filled the entire room. It was a thunderous, heartfelt ovation, the kind that comes from the soul. People were on their feet now, their faces transformed. The cynical smirks were gone, replaced by expressions of genuine emotion. Some were cheering, some were crying, some were just clapping with a fierce intensity. They were not just clapping for a song. They were clapping for courage. They were clapping for honesty. They were clapping for the brother they wished they had, or the brother they wished they had been better to. Through the roar of the crowd, Richard began to move. He didn't walk. He seemed to float, his feet barely touching the thick carpet. All the eyes that had been on Leo were now on him, but he didn't notice. His world had shrunk to the small, humble stage and the man sitting on it. He climbed the 3 steps and crossed the small platform. Leo looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Richard didn't say a word. He just reached out and pulled his brother into a fierce, desperate hug. It wasn't a polite, public embrace. It was the hug of a man drowning who had just been thrown a lifeline. He buried his face in his brother's worn jacket, smelling the faint scent of old wood and fresh air, a smell that was so different from the sterile scent of his office. He held on tight, as if he was afraid that if he let go, Leo would disappear, and this whole night would turn out to be a dream. For a moment, Leo was stiff, his body rigid with surprise. But then he seemed to melt into his brother's arms. He slowly raised his hand and patted Richard's back, a gentle, rhythmic gesture that was more comforting than any words could ever be. The crowd's applause grew even louder, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. They were no longer just guests at a party. They were witnesses to a miracle. They were seeing the great and powerful CEO, the man who controlled a global empire, completely undone, vulnerable, and human. And in his vulnerability, he had never seemed more powerful. The hug seemed to last forever, and yet it was over too soon. Richard finally pulled back, his own face wet with tears. He didn't even realize he was crying. He looked at Leo, a small, shaky smile on his lips. Leo just nodded, his own eyes glistening. The applause began to soften, settling back into a warm, steady hum. The party started to reboot, but it was running on a new kind of energy. The band, which had been silent during the song, started to play again, but the music was softer, more thoughtful. People began to talk, but their conversations were different. The woman in the green gown was no longer talking about art auctions. She was smiling as she spoke to a waiter, asking him about his family. The man with the gold watch had taken out his phone, but he wasn't looking at stock prices. He was swiping through old photos, a sad, tender smile on his face. The invisible walls between people had crumbled. The party for a tech company had accidentally become a celebration of human connection. Richard gently took his brother's arm. "Come on," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's get out of the spotlight." He led Leo off the stage and through the crowd, which parted for them once again. But this time, the looks they received were not of confusion, but of warmth and respect. People smiled at them, some nodding, some whispering quiet words of encouragement as they passed. Richard guided him to a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the noise, near a large potted fern that provided a small island of privacy. They sank into two plush armchairs, the forgotten guitar case resting between them like a sacred object. For a long time, they just sat in comfortable silence, watching the party swirl around them. The tension that had been between them for a decade had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, easy peace. "I'm sorry, Leo," Richard finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "For everything." Leo looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw not the CEO, but the little boy he used to protect. "I know," he said simply. "I was stubborn, too." "That song," Richard said, his eyes drifting to the guitar case. "Where did you learn to write like that?" Leo shrugged, a small sad smile on his face. "Living, I guess. You learn a lot when you spend a lot of time alone with just a guitar for a friend." "You're not alone anymore," Richard said. And the words were a promise. They sat for a while longer, not talking about anything important. They talked about the weather, about a funny dog Leo had once owned, about the terrible coffee Richard had to drink every day. It was the kind of simple, meaningless conversation that two people who have known each other their whole lives can have, and it meant more than any grand speech ever could. The gala for a tech company had become the celebration of a family reunited, stunned into silence by a single song and finally brought back together by its truth. And in a quiet corner of a grand ballroom, two brothers began the slow, wonderful process of getting to know each other again.